So we have a lot of information on what, everyone okay? On what the labor market looks like now. Labor force participation is low. People are very concerned about how long full-time jobs will last. So project out 10, 20, a little further. What does the labor market look like? Paint me a picture. Jody, I'm going to start with you.
So if you look at even what's happened in the last 10 years, Larry Katz and Alan Kruger just released a study in March. 95% of new job creation is coming in the form of alternative job holders, not what we think of as traditional corporate. So we're already seeing this. No one's focused on it, but 95% of job growth, that's extraordinary. If you look at the figures today, I deal in the world of independent talent, the gig economy, but at the high end. We're seeing growth at the high end of the gig economy. 64%, MBO Partners just put out a study. The fastest growing segment is people earning over $100,000 a year. So I think if you start projecting these lines out, I think you're going to see a much more fluid, efficient labor market where people are moving very rapidly from project to project and being hired and retained based on their skills and their specific accomplishments. Mm-hmm. And this, by the way, is not a new idea. Liberation Management was published 30 years ago by, not Michael Porter, Tom Peters, Search of Excellence, and it's finally happening. So,
do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. I think sort of completely inevitable now, the trend towards more of this gig-like work. In fact, I think it's, 30% of people under the age of 26 now have participated in the gig economy in some form or another. Hourly work continues to grow as a share of overall work in America. It's now 79 million jobs in America are paid hourly. So I think the trend and the tide in that direction is inexorable. But I think it's also, a potentially very good thing, and I think you were implying that too. I think it's both scary and also very exciting, because if you think about the problem we have in America today, it's not an unemployment problem, it's an underemployment problem, and a lot of that comes because we've designed these things as big monolithic rocks where there's just a lot of inherent inefficiencies, and if we break them into smaller pieces, I think it creates a lot of opportunity.
Sree, what do you see in the future?
I mean, I think I certainly agree with the idea that we're dealing with a more flexible model, more scheduled, more tightly scheduled, more gig. I'm not sure if it completely replaces the work as we know it, or if it's a complement, right? And that's the part that nobody's quite sure if that's going to work out. So if you look at the other side, which is what happens to the traditional work, I think that goes back to what's going on with the middle income part of the US economy, which hasn't really been doing all that well for at least 20, 25 years, right? And so it depends a little bit on the choices that we make as a nation about how you bolster that middle and how you reinforce the income growth, because we've talked about the future of work, but it's really about the future of incomes. Right. And to the extent that we are able to bolster that, you might see sort of a combination of the gig economy and this sort of traditional work.
I would just point out on the income growth, if you look at markets where they have moved to more of a free agent model, think about Hollywood, think about sports, baseball, what happens is talented people, talent actually becomes more valuable, and they can command higher wages in the market. So I think there is a world in which if you have the right infrastructure, this actually enables more leverage for people with the skills and talent that are in demand.
Right. So it seems like everyone agrees that the idea of flexible work, kind of piecing together your career, your profession, that's not going anywhere. So I wonder what that means when we talk about the social safety net and if that needs to be rethought. Right now, there are so many things that are tethered to work. There are so many safeties and benefits that are tethered to the idea of working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, if not longer. So what happens to the social safety net doesn't need to be rethought, Peter?
Yeah, so, I mean, clearly the system we have today is broken. The bifurcation between 1099 W-2 is just, it just doesn't work for this new economy. Mm-hmm. And we have to fix it. And I don't know if the answer is a third way or if we just have to work at the edges of each of those two. But But the current structure is really is not doing either businesses a service or the worker a service, and therefore not doing America a service.
I mean, it does raise an interesting question, right? Certainly to the extent that the benefits have been tied to an employer, right? The breakdown of that relationship means, who's going to provide the benefits. I would argue it also matters to skill development, right? And we've talked a lot about individual companies that are doing a lot of amazing things to train their workers and apprentice their workers. But if that relationship is breaking down, then what do we do with skill development? Who's going to be doing that, right? And who's part of that signaling mechanism? It can't just be an individual employer then.
And we're unusual. I mean, the U.S. is very unusual in industrialized nations, and it was sort of a historical fluke that so much of our social safety net is tied to traditional employment. And if you really think about it, it's a huge impediment to entrepreneurship and small business. It's a very big advantage that nobody focuses on, that so much of the social safety net is tied to employment, because these big companies, I'm a small business owner, we could not get health care because we're in small and in multiple states, which literally makes us almost uninsurable. And this is something that we never hear about. The actual burden that's been placed on companies is an advantage to them, which is one reason I think it has not been fixed, and something we should all think about.
Do you guys agree with that? It's actually an advantage?
Oh, I think definitely for, it basically has reinforced big business, right? It helps bolster them, it defends their turf. So I think there's no question that it's been it's been propelled by that and reinforced by that.
And I think you have to look at this in the global context. So yes, it's an advantage to the extent that you are a U.S. company, that you're working in the U.S. context, right? It's a disadvantage if you're a small manufacturer and you're competing in a global marketplace, right? And you're seeing a foreign competitor who can offer products that are cheaper than you in the supply chain, right? This is a problem.
Right. What needs to happen for the U.S. to maintain competitiveness?
I mean, I think we have to focus on growth, right? I mean, if you think about the decline of manufacturing, there's sort of a narrative in this country that the decline is inevitable and that we should just find ways to move on. There's nothing inevitable about the decline of manufacturing, right? It declines as a share of the economy, but that's just because people spend on healthcare and education. That's nothing to do with manufacturing. But there's been an absolute decline in U.S. manufacturing output, and that's something that is sort of unique to the U.S. Only the UK has seen something similar, and you can sort of see the political similarities as well, right? And so those are choices that we've made. So you have to figure out how you reinforce growth. How do you get public investment back into manufacturing? How do you create sort of a level playing field? Not for the largest multinational firms, because they'll figure it out, right? It's more for the mid-sized companies and the small companies, because that's where you see the hollowing out happening.
Right. So I'm wondering, when we talk about the gig economy, Jody, you talked about workers who are doing flexible work at the very top of the scale. I think when a lot of people think of this, they think about workers who are kind of on the bottom end of the scale, who are doing things like Uber, et cetera. Thank you. So my question is there a way to bridge that gap, and are we sure that when it comes to flexible work that everyone will be taken care of? Is there a way to create kind of a middle class out of these jobs? Peter, you want to start? Jody?
So a couple things. You talk about flexibility. I was just talking back there. At the high end, flexibility is not what drives people to the gig economy. We survey our folks all the time, and flexibility is 3 or 4 on the reasons they like it. Number 1 and number 2, believe it or not, are they want to pick who they work with and what they work on. It's professional control. Most of the people in our pool are male. They mirror the MBA pool. Most of them are in the sweet spot of their career. They're not retirees. And they don't want to be told on Monday morning, you've got to do a 6-month project in Timbuktu and get on a plane. They want to decide. So it's very interesting that what's driving the high end is not necessarily flexibility. At the low end, lower skill level, I think Peter thinks it is flexibility. And my answer to your question is, we must deal with the economic reality of a work model that is in transition, because we are not yet in a place where there's secure enough project flow and the wages are not high enough that someone who is in the low end of the gig economy is secure. And so, in my view, government needs to step in and acknowledge that. 30% of the workforce is working this way today. It's supposed to go up to 50% by 2020. I think we do need to make changes. affordable benefits, all sorts of things.
Yeah, I tell you though, so I agree with the control. I think there is a common theme there at sort of all wage levels. I think the idea of people feeling empowered, but I certainly flexibility is a big deal. In our case, 30% of the people on our platform are still in school of some kind, so being able to mix and match around their schedules is super critical. But I think also we see just a growing appetite with these younger people to be able to do that, to be able to sort of, one of our largest clients, big retailers, losing workers for the first time this year to these on-demand platforms, making a little bit less without benefits and without the security, but they're doing it because of that feeling of control and empowerment, but also that flexibility, the ability just to open up your phone and find work and pick work. So I think that's a big factor.
Can I just add one thing to that? So certainly if you are an established worker, a higher skilled worker, I think this is a great thing for you, right? But when we think about the lower end, it's not just the low skilled workers, right? It's also, we've talked to nurses, for instance, right? New graduate nurses, and you would think, that's a relatively skilled occupation, right? But you have nurses who can't find work at a single hospital because the hospital has done such a good job at scheduling demand and predicting demand, right? And so you have new graduate nurses who are essentially stitching together 40 hours a week by working 6 hours here, 4 hours there, 1 hour here, 5 hours there, right? And you have all of these kinds of issues about who pays the benefits, who's providing support. Those issues come up even in that context.
Right. And you mentioned income and wages before. We've seen in more traditional jobs there hasn't been a ton of wage growth, especially in the middle. I think a lot of people would like to believe that when you kind of are able to stitch together all of these jobs, it could amount to even more than you were making before. Do you think that's a reality, or do you think what we see, at least in the near term, is more wage volatility and more stagnation?
No, I think it's certainly a reality for, I guess, for those college-educated folks who are, I guess, sort of like me. So I have to question my career assumptions here. It's certainly a reality, I think, for people like me, but I don't think it's a reality for people like those new nurses or certainly for the Uber drivers, right? I mean, what you see, the majority of independent work in the US today is still being done as a secondary income, right? It's not done as the primary income. And so, these are people who are essentially kind of doing some kind of scheduled, they're at the receiving end of the scheduling, and so they're adjusting for that by doing, the Uber stuff and the Airbnb stuff on the side to try to top things up, right? My view is that that's not a sustainable model, right? Something has to give either to provide a benefit so that there's a floor, so these people don't have to worry about basic issues like healthcare or housing, or you have to strengthen the middle and create a much larger market, right? A much larger market growth to create more products and services that then generate employment.
I suppose I'm really very optimistic about this, though, because I think the great thing about this new economy is that actually it's providing opportunities for more mobility, more flexibility, more mobility. We see a lot of people who want the variety, embrace the variety. These new platforms now are creating an opportunity where you're hiring people you wouldn't have hired. I mean, we get into a car today, with strangers. So the same principle applies now. There are people who wouldn't have had opportunities were it not for these platforms. And I think we're going to definitely see a continuation of growth from that. And I think that creates ultimately a much greater meritocracy.
Right. Sree, you talked about the possibility of creating some type of floor. What do you guys think of the universal basic income ideas that have been floating around? Is that something or something similar that should happen in order to create kind of a base level so that people can pursue these other opportunities?
I'm not entirely, so universal basic income comes in many different flavors. Right? Yeah. It's not just as simple as, you get a check in the mail for $1,000 every month. That's certainly one form of it. But universal basic income could be in the form of comprehensive health insurance, right? Everybody gets health insurance, like no questions asked, and then you take care of everything else. It could be in the form of subsidies for other things. It really depends on how UBI is executed, right? And I think honestly the answer is nobody quite knows, right? Which is why you have the experiments in Finland to try to figure out, is this a disincentive for people to stop to work, or is it actually creating a market that's robust enough that actually attracts more people to come in and work, right? I don't know if we have any evidence one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less about whether it's UBI or some other solution. I think the important thing is to recognize we are in a moment of massive transition in the labor market. And it's not just the independent work and the gig economy, it's AI, it's all the new skills, it's the skills gap. And because of that, the infrastructure and the training that will help people move from where we are to where we need to be isn't in place. And so the question is, how do we help those people who are being hurt in this transition? This is not unique. It happened in the Industrial Revolution, and I think the role of government and business to solve this is critical. And there are a lot of ways you could solve it, and I think it's very important that we solve it, because otherwise you're going to lose support for the innovation that I think you can gain by some of the transition that's happening. But if we don't protect the people being hurt, we're going to have issues.
Where do you guys think the onus is when it comes to protecting workers as these transitions happen? Is it private employers? Is the onus on workers to get training? Is it on the government to create protections?
I think it's everybody.
I think whatever we do, it mustn't be, reinforcing the role of big employers, right? Because, we want to head to a future. I think it's exciting to head to a future where there is a growth in entrepreneurship, and we all, we embrace and empower people. So whatever we do, and I agree that we need to create a better infrastructure and a better foundation. It needs to be done, in a way that's thoughtful, that isn't just in favoring the status quo or large entrenched interests.
Yeah, Sree.
I mean, I think we have a significant first mover problem, which is more so in this country than in others, I think. And that's, so an individual employer will say justifiably, right, that if they invest a whole lot of money in training their workers, all it takes is for a neighboring company to raise wages by a little bit, and these workers will move. And that's a valid argument, right? And so, we sort of have a situation where as a nation, we've sort of decided we don't want to pick winners and losers, but we leave it to the individual firms and the individual cities and the counties to decide, and what they end up doing is focusing exactly on keeping an individual plant open or trying to get a specific firm to come and invest. And, you end up picking winners and losers, even though you're trying not to pick winners and losers, right? So the answer, I think, to your question is there has to be some kind of coordination. It's beyond the scope of any one firm or any one government agency or any one local government to solve the problem. What you need is scale, because with the scale and the mobility, you get more of this sort of, if you're able to get people to move from one firm to another, one industry to another, that's how you get incomes to grow.
And do you see the possibility of that happening in the near term?
I think so. I mean, there's plenty of initiatives out there. There's a lot of regional initiatives, whether it's in the Great Lakes region, the other parts of the Midwest have tried to do it. There's portions of the Mid-Atlantic that are trying to do it. There are many of these cities that are kind of banding together to try to create these sort of mega regions in a way, right, to try to get that kind of scale and get that cohesion across boundaries. So there's a lot of ideas out there, and I think the question is which ones work, and then how do you scale that up, and I think we're still in the experiment.
Right. And when we talk about these mega regions, as you said, a lot of times I think when we think about flexible work, when we think about innovation around this, it happens in cities and around cities, and that can leave out a lot of suburban and rural workers. So how are you guys thinking about the ways that flexible work, gig economy, innovation can reach those workers who are also undergoing some of the trauma from a changing workplace? Jody?
One of the great things that's happening is a lot of the platforms today are enabling remote work. So if you look at a platform called Upwork, what used to be called Elance, if you're into this world, 99% of the work done on that platform is remote. Now, much of that is actually cross-border. A lot of what they're doing is finding people around the world who can do web design and things like that, or coding. But the fact of the matter is, more and more work can be done remotely, and ultimately that will benefit the population you're talking about as well.
Yeah, and I would say, in an environment where public investment is falling, geographic mobility is falling, right, and you have communities that are essentially getting hollowed out, I would rather have the tech platforms, because at least it gives you some opportunities, helps you cushion the blow a little bit, than not have the tech platforms. And I think the question is that a replacement for what you think would need to happen? And I'm not quite sure. I think you still need the investment in those local communities.
Right. So a lot of the conversation among legislators, among lawmakers, when it comes to protecting workers, someone mentioned 1099 employees, has seemed reactive and not proactive. And the thing that I hear a lot is that it's really hard to anticipate how jobs, how an industry is going to change, and thus to try and create protectionary law around it. Do you guys think we know enough about the future of work, or at least the future of flexible work in the gig economy, to perhaps start being proactive about creating worker protections? Jody?
Yeah, I mean, not only do I think we know, you have people like Sarah Horowitz, who founded the Freelancers Union, who have, been working very hard to provide guidance and leadership around what needs to happen. You've got Aspen Institute has a Future of Work initiative, and Senator Warner is leading some legislative changes. So there is, I think, some proactive effort. It's not the highest priority on anybody's list, and I think that's an issue. And you've got a lot of entrenched interests. I mean, if you look at what happened with Uber, take away what you think of Uber, you end up also finding yourselves on the opposite side of unions in this case. And so there's a lot of political dynamics that have to be sorted out. But I think there are people who are trying to become leaders in driving this.
Well, and I mean, just because it's such a complex issue, just narrow down on one aspect of that, which is health benefits. It's ridiculous today that you kind of either have them or you don't have them. The idea that they belong to the employer, that they can't be portable, that if you work 20 hours, you don't get to accrue some benefits here. And if you work, rather than working 40 hours with one employee, you work 20 with one and 20 with the other, that you can't somehow, share and pool those benefits is ridiculous. So I think that there's a very concrete opportunity for us to sort of really solve that problem.
Sree, do you agree with that? Do you think we're at the point where we can start formulating things and solving the problem?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's enough of an installed base, there's enough critical mass, right? And we've already had a track record just in the last 2 or 3 years, right, of institutions banding together to start resolving some of these issues. So I think we already have a pretty decent sense. I mean, there may be more, but at least we have a good sense to get going.
Audience, if you could join me in thanking our panel for their time.